Welcome to episode 41 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. A couple of years ago, I attended a professional development day hosted by a school in the suburbs of Chicago. This summit was organized by the EdTech team, and included in the swag bag I received at registration was a book titled Dive into Inquiry, Amplify Learning and Empower Student Voice. Needless to say, I was intrigued. I read the book when I got back and was simply enamored by what author Trevor MacKenzie was doing with his students. This, to me, became a gold standard in personalized learning for students. Trevor highlights how he scaffolds the learning in his room to go from structured inquiry all the way to free inquiry. The book is highlighted with stories of projects his students have chosen over the years for their free inquiry project. And not only are the students learning, they are taking ownership in the what, how, why, when, and where they are learning. I picked up on several new ideas when I reread the book to prepare for today's episode. That's because Trevor MacKenzie is going to join us on Anchored in Education today to talk more about his book, Dive into Inquiry. Trevor is an award-winning teacher from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Trevor can also be found traveling the globe talking to educators on inquiry in workshops and keynotes. But today, he can be found here, and we're going to learn something from him. Trevor, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Scott, thanks so much for having me. It's been long in the works, and I'm just so thankful to be here with you and your audience today. Thank you.
Well, I can't even begin to describe how excited I am to talk more about Dive into Inquiry and just hear more of the good things you have to say. But before we get started, I think that we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm a full-time high school teacher in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and I'm also an inquiry author and consultant. So I have the privilege of being able to visit schools around the world to support them in implementing inquiry. And, to be honest, I think inquiry has always been a part of my DNA, if you will.
Okay.
I always was, as a young man, as a child, quite a curious little guy and quite a hands-on learner. And I really valued, those classrooms that I grew up through that, allowed me to move around and allowed me to get my hands into something, if you will. And I think part of that was just the strong relationships that I was around as a learner. I had some amazing teachers who just really believed in me as I grew up. And when it came time to set my sights on a career path, it just made sense. It was just something that was always speaking to me, a way to give back and create those strong relationships in my classroom. And inquiry, although I didn't know it was inquiry at the time, it's always been a part of how I learn and how I operate. So it just makes sense that looking back at it all now, I am doing what I'm doing today, if you will.
All right. And I think what you're doing is something that it intrigues me, and I think that my audience would agree. So today we're talking about inquiry-based learning and your first book, which is Dive into Inquiry. And before we get into that, though, you kind of hinted around how you were as a student, but I'd like to talk about your time in teaching before you implemented inquiry-based learning. And at what point in your career did you realize that a shift needed to happen in your classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, if I reflect back on the first 5 years of my career or 7 or 8 years, if you will, I worked with really diverse students and really challenging environments. I had a caseload of at-risk students and the curriculum kind of came second to the relationship that needed to happen in the room.
Sure.
And, no good learning or no exploring of our curriculum could occur unless that strong relationship was kind of at the forefront of every decision I was making. And, those years were really trying, not just because of the students I was working with, but just because I was a young teacher trying to get my feet under me and understand, all those big things that are part of teaching, assessment and lesson and unit design and school culture. And so, for me at the time, it had to be relationship, and then it had to be relevant to the students. If the students didn't see themselves in the curriculum and see themselves as being an active member of our learning community, quite literally, my students wouldn't show up to class, and I would be chasing them down in the halls or, trying to track them down to get them back to school. So, I think those first 5 to 8 years were really, where I cut my teeth, not just as a teacher, but more specifically as an inquiry practitioner, if you will. And I'm so thankful for those hard times. At the time, there were very challenging days, long days and long months, but I think those students that I worked with, they really formed and solidified my understanding of my role in the classroom. And so much of the work I share now when I visit schools around the world is founded on those hard years. So I'm thankful for those years, and definitely that's where inquiry definitely came to surface in my practice more meaningfully, if you will.
Okay, so you said 5 to 8 years in the beginning, and then now how long have you been just complete with the inquiry-based learning?
Yeah, so I'm entering I think it's my 19th year of being a teacher.
Oh, wow, okay.
And really, I think the language around inquiry started to take shape in my practice more meaningfully about 10 years ago. I had an amazing teacher librarian who always had an empty seat. And what I mean by that is, I'd poke my head in his office and I'd ask him, hey, can I bother you with a question? Or I've got this zany idea I want to put into practice. Can we talk about it? And he would listen, and he would just subtly, slide me over a resource or email me a couple hours later with something that, resonated with him that he thought I would appreciate reading or watching or listening to. And so slowly through that relationship, I became more acquainted with the language around inquiry. And it was resonating with me because it was obviously something that I had experienced growing up and that I was practicing in the classroom and slowly kind of, smoothing out the edges, if you will. And I'm just so thankful that teacher, librarian, gave me some of that language and kind of pushed me in down certain pathways to sharpen that language and then, of course, in turn, sharpen my practice. So I've been an inquiry teacher, I think, more intentionally for about the last 10 to 12 years, yeah.
Now, I think many educators who are unfamiliar with inquiry-based learning think of it as an unstructured free-for-all in learning, but you show it is actually the opposite. So before we get into the types of student inquiry pool metaphor, can you talk a little bit more about how co-designing learning still covers key curricular areas with just a kind of a different approach?
Yeah, you raise a really good point. I think the research tells us that one of the problems with inquiry is that there are just so many definitions out there about what inquiry is. And some teachers think it's free inquiry and it's just that student-centered framework 100% of the time, which can lead to not just that feeling of messiness and uncertainty, but also, heightened anxiety and lack of confidence for our students because they don't necessarily have the skills and understandings to be successful with that deep agency over learning. So what I propose is that we back away from that and we look at all types of inquiry. And there are 4 types, but more specifically at the start of the year, I do a lot of co-designing of the learning parameters. And what I mean by that is, I really draw the curtain back from our curriculum and I allow my students, I give them the time and the space to see the landscape of our classroom and what it is that we have to know and have to do. But then I also ask them, what do you want to know and what do you want to explore and how do you want to demonstrate your learning? And it's a balancing of those 2 ends of our educational landscape that I think the inquiry classroom really, really drives home quite powerfully. The curriculum is not, or I should say inquiry isn't something we do off the side of our desk as we teach the curriculum. These are 2 pieces of how we operate in the class, and they're woven together. And so really, bringing in student voice, knowing their interests and their curiosities and their passions and their talents, and having those guide us through the curriculum, allowing us to explore the curriculum as kind of, as you said, co-designers, where it's not just a top-down approach of the teacher to the student, but there's a balancing of our roles throughout the year. And at times those roles will shift. At times there will be a more teacher-directed framework or inquiry,
Sure.
and at times there will be more of a student-centered inquiry. And that's really what I propose, to not just support us exploring the curriculum, but more importantly, support our students as we explore our curriculum.
And as we go along here, I will touch on this a little bit more, but I think that you would agree when you ask students what they're interested in and what drives them and what they want to learn about, you really see magical things happen in your classroom.
I do, and to be frank, sometimes if I ask students what they're passionate about or what they're interested in, sometimes I'll get shrugged shoulders. I'll get students who are quite disengaged, or they'll say, just tell me what I need to know. Tell me what I need to do.
Yeah.
And that just breaks my heart, because what that tells me is that, we've kind of schooled the curiosity out of them by the time they enter our high school setting. And really part of my focus, my lens in the inquiry classroom, is to have the curriculum come to life for our students. Really start with high engagement, high curiosity, high interest first. And if our students aren't interested in our curriculum, how can I spark that interest? How can I show them something really meaningful or relevant to them, not to me, to them, so that that's our rich entry point into exploring our curriculum. So, I totally agree. A lot of amazing things happen when things are personally relevant to the student. As an English teacher, one thing I always see is just writing comes to life. When students are writing about a topic or an experience that they lived through, that they are passionate about, undeniably their marks using our assessment tools on that piece of writing skyrocket. And I think that
Wow.
speaks a lot to just how powerful relevance to the learner is. And so the balancing act, again, is how can we make our curriculum personally relevant to each and every student in the room? And that's a huge challenge, but that's the heart of my work, if I'm honest, is bringing in relevance and interest and curiosity to our curriculum to really hook each and every one of our students, whether they are struggling in school, whether they are achieving well in school, whether they come from diverse backgrounds culturally or socioeconomically. All of our students have the rights to explore something personally relevant to them. And that truly is the heart of my work, Scott.
All right. So a few minutes ago, I don't know if people heard this, but I mentioned this pool metaphor, and maybe some were thinking, well, what was they talking about? But this is about the types of student inquiry. So a quick moment of truth for me. When I got to this page, I just stared at the image for a long time because it was a shining moment of clarity, at least for myself. So let's quickly discuss these 4 types of student inquiry.
Yeah, I appreciate those kind words, Scott. Thanks so much. And listeners, you can find this image on my website, trevormackenzie.com. You can download it for free, as well as all of the sketch notes, the images from my published work. And I raise that point because the swimming pool graphic is actually, it's printed off and it's posted in my classroom. It is something that I use with my students frequently to demonstrate not just the different types of inquiry, but how their role in learning will shift throughout the school year. So, if listeners want to pause and find that image, or I'll just describe it briefly to you. As swimming pools are designed, there's a shallow end, and slowly that shallow end becomes more and more deep until we get to, of course, the deep end of a swimming pool. And so the shallower end of the inquiry pool is one in which we call it structured and controlled. And the shallower end of the pool is very much a teacher-directed inquiry, where the teacher's choosing that big overarching question that we're going to explore together. The teacher is choosing the resources that we'll all unpack together. And the teacher's choosing the demonstration of understanding, that summative piece. And slowly what we see through the pool, through these different types, is ownership over those elements of our unit design begin to shift from the teacher to the student. So eventually, in the deep end of the pool, where students have the most amount of agency over learning, they're designing the question that they're going to explore. We're facilitating the research, and they're really enriched in that research process. What is valid and what is invalid? What is the difference between an article and a journal, etc.? And then they're choosing the demonstration of understanding that summative piece. And there are other elements to an inquiry unit, but those are a few of the most prominent ones, just to speak to the audience at home here. But again, it's that gradual shift of responsibility from the teacher to the student that the swimming pool really proposes, and helping teachers understand that it's just not free inquiry 100% of the time. Students will be more successful in free inquiry when we explore these other more teacher-directed inquiry types first, to give our students those skills and understandings and competencies to be successful with more agency over learning, Scott.
All right. And again, if they have the book, Dive into Inquiry, it's on page 28. If they do not, they can go to trevormackenzie.com. I will link that on my website as well. And I believe they can purchase the book from your website, or find the link. And so
Absolutely, yeah, they can.
then they can really see what we're talking about, because it really does help having that visual. But then at about halfway point in the book, you shift the focus on that deep end of the inquiry pool, so the guided and free inquiry, which makes sense because increased student agency is our ultimate goal. And you even admit that having so many students independently exploring their own essential questions can become overwhelming. But as we have seen, we use scaffolding to get to this point. So again, on page 42, you have an amazing illustration showing the inquiry process in 7 amazing steps, and it all begins with the 4 pillars of inquiry. So let's take a moment to expand on these 4 pillars.
Yeah, so, first and foremost, I'm a big proponent of the more voice and choice our students have, the more structures and frameworks we should give them to be successful with that agency over learning. And you mentioned the inquiry process, those 7 steps. That's definitely one of the frameworks that all of my students operate in to help them be successful with that agency over learning. But the 4 pillars specifically provide each and every student in our classroom a personalized entry point into inquiry. And what I mean by that is, whether it's a curiosity, whether it's a goal, whether it's a passion our students have, all of our students need an entry point into our curriculum. Because as I said earlier, if I were just to ask my students, what are you passionate about? Many of my students would say, I don't know, tell me what I want to, or what you want me to know, what you want me to do.
Sure.
And, passions are a really interesting thing, Scott, in that I feel that passions require a ton of support to have something turn into a passion, to have it, be nurtured into something that a student actually loves. It could be a parent who's driving their child to football practice time and time again over years for football to turn into something that student really loves. It could be a musical instrument that a student has gone to countless hours of rehearsing and practicing with a musical teacher. But the point is, there's someone in the background there in those students' lives who are helping these things that started out as interests or curiosities to our kids turn into passions. And so the 4 pillars help us avoid that trap of just exploring passion-based learning and allow all of our students an entry point. I have some students who are just so goal-focused, whether that's a career path they want to take, whether that's a new skill they want to learn. And by having them have this really amazing entry point into inquiry of the goal being their focus, amazing things happen, not just engagement and relevance for the student, but the work ethic increases when they are genuinely exploring something that's meaningful to them. And that's one question I ask all my students: how is your learning meaningful to you? And if they can't answer that question, then that inquiry is not worthy of our time. So the 4 pillars really do drive home the idea of a personalized entry point into our curriculum for each and every student. And that allows me to best support them because we're all kind of operating using the same language, the same framework, the same context, and it becomes a lot less messy and uncertain both for me and my students. And when I mean messy and uncertain, I mean more likely to be successful at the end of the inquiry.
So, Trevor, I feel like we can't move on without having a conversation on essential questions, which, in the inquiry process, it happens to be step 2 because you got to have that early on. But I guess you could say this is a cornerstone to the students' inquiry process as they develop the direction of what will soon be their planning and research. Now, if the question can be Googled, it's not an essential question. So, how do we get students to think big and deep when constructing an essential question?
Yeah, I think for the listeners at home, this is probably the greatest shift we can make towards adopting more of an inquiry approach, is to begin learning with a question. And whether it's our essential question, the teacher's design question, or the student's. It's the question first. And the question invites curiosity, invites unpacking of a resource or resources through the lens of answering that question. And so if you can imagine that swimming pool analogy again, throughout the structured and controlled inquiry, the shallow end of the pool, I'm modeling the use of questions, and I'm really showing them front and center our overarching question. Literally, it's posted above my projector screen in my classroom. So I could always point to that whenever we're talking or reading or discussing something. We can always point to that question and make connections to that question. And framing all of our learning around deepening our understanding of that question, so that later on in the year, when it's the student who's designing the question, they see the framework of how the question leads to deeper learning. If I were to get really specific as to how I challenge my students to become stronger questioners, how I deepen their understanding of the role of an essential question, how we unpack the difference between closed-ended questions and open-ended questions, because both are very important in inquiry. If I were to really pinpoint how that looks in my classroom, it'd be the question formulation technique. And the question formulation technique is something that's designed by Dan Rothstein and Lou Santana, two amazing educators down in California. And their book is titled Make Just One Change. And in their book, they outline this framework, this protocol that we can use in our classrooms to have students become stronger questioners. And in my class, it takes us about 30 to 40 minutes to go through a whole QFT exercise, where if you can imagine, we start with a topic, and then through this exercise, slowly we generate questions from that topic. We identify, are these open-ended questions or closed-ended questions? We start to rewrite some of these questions. And then the final product of the activity is an overarching, ungoogleable, if you will, essential question. So throughout the year, we'll work on the QFT so that by the time we get to the deep end of the pool, students are stronger questioners, undeniably, and that's as a direct result of the QFT. Earlier on in my career, I used to ask my students to draft their own essential questions. And I'd say, bring up your essential question, and I'll read it, and I'll give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And it felt like 9 times out of 10, students would draft a question, and they'd bring it to me, and it wouldn't be an overarching, ungoogleable question. It would be more a closed-ended question.
Yeah.
And I would just simply revise it for them. I would just simply read it and say, change it to this. And then I would rewrite it for them. And what I was realizing was I'm really good at writing essential questions, and I've done very little to help my students become better at writing those essential questions. And the question formulation technique has been the biggest shift in terms of helping my students become stronger questioners, undeniably. Anytime I work with a school or a school district, I walk teachers through the question formulation technique. We'll actually do it as an exercise so teachers can understand how to do it with their students, but also so teachers leave with an overarching essential question that they could apply to a unit design of their own. So, for listeners at home, the Right Question organization, that's the website that's attached to Dan and Luz's work. They have so many free resources to give away to help you, enrich your reading of Make Just One Change. But, you could just go right to the website and see what they have to offer, and that will start your kind of journey into the QFT, Scott.
Well, that sounds like another excellent resource that I'm going to put on today's episode if listeners want to visit there so they can read more about that and visit that link as well. Let me tell you, I love how the inquiry process scaffolds to the next step. And I mean, we've talked a lot about the scaffolding just in the process alone, back to that pool metaphor, but the actual inquiry process scaffolds one step to the next. So from the essential questions, we move to planning and proposal, exploring and researching, and then collecting learning evidence. So successfully moving through these 5 steps leads us to the final 2, which are creating an authentic piece and public display of understanding. I have a feeling, though, these 2 steps are more than just demonstrating learning for you as the teacher. I'm guessing this is more of a triumphant moment for the students.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of my classes still conclude with some kind of summative piece. Sometimes that's, the provincial mandated government exam, if you will. And many schools I visit around the world have that standardized assessment at the end of the year. In my province, our standardized assessment at the end of our senior level English class is worth 40% of my students' overall mark. And so It really does shape some of what learning looks like towards the end of the year. But no matter what the government tells me I need to do as a summative piece, I always finish the year off with a gala, an inquiry gala. And that's a showcase of learning from throughout the year where students can share with a public audience what it is that they've learned, what it is that they've explored, what was meaningful to them. Oftentimes, students invite not just family members, but people who have impacted their learning from throughout the year. I always call on my students to interview someone, an expert in a field that is going to support their personalized inquiry towards the end of the year. And so they invite these people that they've interviewed into the gala. And it really becomes a really rich conversation around their learning rather than a summative assessment, that standardized exam, if you will. Students just really enjoy talking about what it is that they explored and they learned. And part of that is unpacking the challenges that they face, the barriers that they face, and strategies that they utilize to overcome those challenges. Part of it is, looking at a portfolio of their learning and sharing all these little pieces of the process of the year rather than just the summative. And then part of it is that rich collaboration and communication that happens in the moment, right? Like students are actually having a conversation
Sure.
with an authentic audience that goes beyond me and goes beyond their peers. These are people that they're genuinely proud to share their learning to. And so I think, as our students leave our schools, those are the competencies, the skills that I really hope they've acquired. Are they more confident in communicating? Are they more successful in collaboration? Can they hold up a conversation? Like that is a really rich skill that I want all of our young people to sharpen, right? And I think that gala event not just honors the hard work that they've done throughout the year, but it really instills that those competencies and that experience. It's really, really important. And time and time again, we do both. We do the gala, and then we do that summative piece. And I strongly believe that summative piece, the state-mandated exam, if you will, it's strengthened by the experience of sharing their learning throughout the year and at the gala, because partly it's just really meaningful to kids. They leave feeling so full of pride and so confident that whatever that test is or that summative piece is, they're on cloud nine and they're just really ready to rock it. Now, I do quite a bit of direct teaching to any assessment tool towards the end of the year. I strongly believe that students need to know the assessment tool for them to be really successful on that assessment. So this isn't an either or conversation. This isn't, Mr. MacKenzie does the gala, but he doesn't do the mandated test. It's definitely a both. And I definitely focus on those assessment tools as well as the gala.
One part that I caught there that I love, the pride and the confidence. That's the students you're talking about. And I think that if we can get to the point where students are leaving with that pride and that confidence, then we've done our job.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this has been a global shift I've seen in education over the last 10 years is really how can we move away from an over-standardized curriculum and assessment framework towards one of that is more personalized and more directed at the student and each student, not just the students we work with, but each student, and understanding who they are, what they value, and what their strengths are and what their challenges are. And I just think it's such a beautiful time to be in education, not just because of the shift, but because we're just so globally connected, aren't we? Like here you and I are talking, Scott,
Yeah.
and we're on other sides of the continent, and we have listeners from around the world who are
Yes.
chewing on similar questions that we're unpacking in this podcast, because schools around the world are on a similar journey of an over-standardized approach to a more personalized one. And in that transition, there's some gray, there's some murkiness, there's some muddiness. And I think conversations such as that you and I are having are giving some clarity to teachers, right? And really coming to the heart of the matter, which is that pride and that meaningfulness, if you will, for each and every one of our students.
Which I guess this is a perfect segue before we go, because I'm almost certain that we have some listeners who are saying, sure, this works for Trevor because he's been doing it for, we found out now, 10 to 12 years. But a piece of advice you give in your book is to start small, chip away at it, as you say. But then at the end, you give another piece of solid advice that is find comfort in the mess of uncertainty. And so can we close by having a conversation about this statement as well as encourage listeners to thoughtfully consider inquiry learning?
Yeah, Scott, I never propose that every teacher teach the exact same way, nor do I propose that they teach exactly like me. I think teaching is an art. I think it requires nuance and agility and, the amount of times in a single day that I pivot. I'm working with one student and their needs are completely different than a student that I turn and face throughout my class. So I really do encourage listeners to, really take into heart what they've heard throughout this podcast, explore my work more deeply, my 2 books, my website, and if there are any questions, reach out via Twitter or the contact form on my website. I am an open book, quite literally. But in that, I do encourage listeners to start small, as you've mentioned. A lot of what you see in my work it's kind of a 3-year transition away from that teacher-centered framework to more of a student-centered framework. And in that transition, undeniably, there are going to be days where we're feeling like we're not doing it right, or perhaps we're not doing it well enough as we could be. But in that learning, in that messiness, that's where the true shifts occur. That's where the true magic happens for our students. If we're always doing things the way that we've always done them, not only is there no progression and no innovation, but really we're not changing with the world around us. And that's really what I think inquiry strongly supports, is that it's adapted to the changing world around us, from student to student, from country to country, culture to culture. I think inquiry is the framework that allows us to be a little bit more nuanced and agile in how we explore our curriculum and better meet the needs of our students. So when I say, get comfortable in the mess of uncertainty, really what I'm trying to say there for listeners is in that uncertainty, that's where the really rich learning happens. And if we can model that for our students, if we can model that the process is more important than the outcome, I think we're setting our students up for being lifelong learners, which is, at the end of the day, that's my main goal for my students, is that they have these skills and understandings and competencies that will lead them into a meaningful life. And whatever meaningful means to each student, that's where inquiry is the framework that allows me to discover that with my students.
Absolutely. Putting students' interests first and forefront in our classrooms is definitely important. The book we're talking about today is Dive into Inquiry. The author is Trevor MacKenzie, and you have truly been a source of inspiration hearing you speak and reading your book. I love it what you're doing in education and for educators across the world, and I really appreciate you coming on and joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Scott, thanks for hosting me. I'm a big fan, and I appreciate everyone for listening to the episode. I'm looking forward to sharing it with my network. And again, Scott, thanks so much for having me.
Now, you can find Trevor on Twitter by searching at Trev_MacKenzie. You can also learn more about Trevor by visiting escottengland.com and clicking the Read More link under today's episode. I'll also have a wealth of resources that Trevor and I discussed today. Now, before I wrap up today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. Dive into Inquiry is a book I recommend everyone read. Even if you do not believe free inquiry is a good fit for you, I guarantee you will find strategies for improving your craft. Did you notice the common theme from today's episode? It is delivering content and instruction to students in a way that best fits the learner. Dive into Inquiry shows us how we can leverage students' passions and curiosities to provide meaningful and impactful learning. I look to my professional network and see many districts doing amazing things with students taking control of their learning. But Trevor's book allows classroom teachers to begin making a progressive shift into fostering student agency. I think too often we have students in our classes who are disengaged or distracted or simply obstinate to being an active participant in class. We label these students as insubordinate, disruptive, or sometimes class clowns. Too many times, these students are defined as a problem in our classroom. They get removed from class, or they get suspended, or expelled, or worse, they drop out. And we didn't touch on this in the interview, but Trevor had one of these students in his class, and he is quite candid in the first chapter of Dive into Inquiry, talking about the student who reshaped how Trevor would forever approach teaching and learning in his classroom. The best part? This student, The son of two high school dropouts, the brother of an expelled student, not only found success in Trevor's room, but found success in other areas of school and was rewarded with a trip across the stage in June to receive his diploma. We have now all benefited from this student who was in Trevor's class, because what blossomed from this experience transformed Trevor's teaching and can now be found neatly compiled in this book, waiting to begin the transformation of our teaching. It will be good for us, and it will be great for our students, because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.